This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. Mysticism, a study in nature and development of spiritual consciousness by Evelyn Underhill. First half of Part 2, Chapter 8. Ecstasy and Rapture. Since the object of all contemplation is the production of that state of intimate communion in which the mystics declare that the self is in God and God is in her, it might be supposed that the horizon of union represented the end of mystical activity, insofar as it is concerned with the attainment of a transitory but exalted consciousness of oneness with the Absolute. Nearly all the great contemplators, however, describe as a distinct and regard as a more advanced phase of the spiritual consciousness the group of definitely ecstatic states in which the concentration of interest on the transcendent is so complete, the gathering up and pouring out of life on this one point so intense, that the subject is more or less entranced, and becomes, for the time of the ecstasy, unconscious of the external world. In ordinary contemplation he refused to attend to that external world. It was there, a blurred image, at the fringe of his conscious field, but he deliberately left it on one side. In ecstasy he cannot attend to it. None of its messages reach him, not even those most insistent of all messages which are translated into the terms of bodily pain. All mystics agree in regarding such ecstasy as an exceptionally favourable state, the one in which man's spirit is caught up to the most immediate union with the divine. The word has become a synonym for joyous exaltation, for the inebriation of the infinite. The induced ecstasies of the Dionysian mysteries, the metaphysical raptures of the Neoplatonists, the voluntary or involuntary trance of Indian mystics and Christian saints, all these, however widely they may differ in transcendental value, agree in claiming such value, in declaring that this change in the quality of consciousness brought with it a valid and ineffable apprehension of the real. Clearly, this apprehension will vary in quality and content with the place of the subject in the spiritual scale. The ecstasy is merely the psychophysical condition which accompanies it. It is hardly a paradox to say, says Myers, that the evidence for ecstasy is stronger than the evidence for any other religious belief. Of all the subjective experiences of religion, ecstasy is that which has been most urgently, perhaps the psychologist most convincingly, asserted, and it is not confined to any one religion. From the medicine man of the lowest savages up to St. John, St. Peter, and St. Paul, with Buddha and Muhammad on the way, we find records which, though morally and intellectually much differing, are in psychological essence the same. There are three distinct aspects under which the ecstatic state may be studied: A, the physical; B, the psychological; C, the mystical. Many of the deplorable misunderstandings and still more deplorable mutual recriminations which surround its discussion come from the refusal of experts in one of these three branches to consider the results arrived at by the other two. A. Physically considered, ecstasy is a trance, more or less deep, more or less prolonged. The subject may slide into it gradually from a period of absorption in, or contemplation of, some idea which has filled the field of consciousness. Or it may come on suddenly, the appearance of the idea, or even some word or symbol suggesting the idea, abruptly throwing the subject into an entranced condition. This is the state which some mystical writers call rapture. The distinction, however, is a conventional one, and the works of the mystics describe many intermediate forms. During the trance, breathing and circulation are depressed. The body is more or less cold and rigid, remaining in the exact position which it occupied at the oncoming of the ecstasy, however difficult and unnatural this pose may be. Sometimes entrancement is so deep that there is complete anesthesia, as in the case which I quote from the life of St. Catherine of Siena. Credible witnesses report that Bernadette, the visionary of Lourdes, held the flaming end of a candle in her hand for 15 minutes during one of her ecstasies. She felt no pain, neither did the flesh show any marks of burning. Similar instances of ecstatic anesthesia abound in the lives of the saint, and are also characteristic of certain pathological states. The trance includes, according to the testimony of the ecstatics, two distinct phases: A, the short period of lucidity, and B, a longer period of complete unconsciousness, which may pass into a death-like catalepsy lasting for hours, or, as once with St. Teresa, for days. The difference between union and trance, says Teresa, is this, that the latter lasts longer and is more visible outwardly, because the breathing gradually diminishes so that it becomes impossible to speak or to open the eyes. And though this very thing occurs when the soul is in union, there is more violence in a trance, for the natural warmth vanishes, I know not how, when the rapture is deep. And in all these kinds of horizon there is more or less of this. When it is deep, as I was saying, the hands become cold and sometimes stiff and straight as pieces of wood. As to the body, if the rapture comes on when it is standing or kneeling, it remains so. And the soul is so full of the joy of that which our Lord is setting before it, that it seems to forget to animate the body and abandons it. If the rapture lasts, the nerves are made to feel it. Such ecstasy as this, so far as its physical symptoms go, is not, of course, the peculiar privilege of the mystics. It is an abnormal bodily state, caused by a psychic state, and this causal psychic state may be healthy or unhealthy, the result of genius or disease. It is common in the little understood type of personality called sensitive or mediumistic. It is a well-known symptom of certain mental and nervous illnesses. A feeble mind concentrated on one idea, like a hypnotic subject gazing at one spot, easily becomes entranced, however trivial the idea which gained possession of his consciousness. Apart from its content, then, ecstasy carries no guarantee of spiritual value. It merely indicates the presence of certain abnormal psychophysical conditions, an alteration of the normal equilibrium, a shifting of the threshold of consciousness which leaves the body and the whole usual external world outside instead of inside the conscious field, and even affects those physical functions, such as breathing, which are almost entirely automatic. Thus ecstasy, physically considered, may occur in any person in whom, 1, the threshold of consciousness is exceptionally mobile, and 2, there is a tendency to dwell upon one governing idea or intuition. Its worth depends entirely on the objective value of that idea or intuition. In the hysterical patient, thanks to an unhealthy condition of the centres of consciousness, any trivial or irrational idea, any one of the odds and ends stored up in the subliminal region, may thus become fixed, dominate the mind, and produce entrancement. Such ecstasy is an illness. The emphasis is on the pathological state which makes it possible. In the mystic, the idea which fills his life is so great a one, the idea of God, that in proportion as it is vivid, real, and intimate, it inevitably tends to monopolize the field of consciousness. Here the emphasis is on the overpowering strength of spirit, not on the feeble and unhealthy state of body or mind. This true ecstasy, says Godfreneau, is not a malady, but the extreme form of a state which must be classed amongst the ordinary accidents of conscious life. The mystics themselves are fully aware of the importance of this distinction. Ecstasies, no less than visions and voices, must, they declare, be subjected to unsparing criticism before they are recognized as divine. Whilst some are undoubtedly of God, others are no less clearly of the devil. The great doctors of the mystic life, says Malaval, teach that there are two sorts of rapture, which must be carefully distinguished. The first are produced in persons but little advanced in the way, and still full of selfhood, either by the force of a heated imagination, which vividly apprehends a sensible object, or by the artifice of the devil. These are the raptures which St. Teresa calls, in various parts of her works, raptures of feminine weakness. The other sort of rapture is, on the contrary, the effect of pure intellectual vision in those who have a great and generous love for God. To generous souls who have utterly renounced themselves, God never fails in these raptures to communicate high things. All the mystics agree with Malival in finding the test of a true ecstasy, not in its outward sign, but in its inward grace, its after value. And here psychology would do well to follow their example. The ecstatic states, which are supreme instances of the close connection between body and soul, have bodily as well as mental results. And those results are as different and as characteristic as those observed in healthy and in morbid organic processes. If the concentration has been upon the highest centre of consciousness, the organ of spiritual perception, if a door has really been opened by which the self has escaped for an instant to the vision of that which is, the ecstasy will be good for life. The entrancement of disease, on the contrary, is always bad for life, its concentration being upon the lower instead of the higher levels of mentality. It depresses rather than enhances the vitality, the fervour or the intelligence of its subject, and leaves behind it an enfeebled will, and often moral and intellectual chaos. Ecstasies that do not produce considerable profit either to the persons themselves or others deserve to be suspected, says Augustine Baker, and when any marks of their approaching are perceived, the persons ought to divert their minds some other way. It is the difference between a healthy appetite for nourishing food and a morbid craving for garbage. The same organs of digestion are used in satisfying both, yet he would be a hardy physiologist who undertook to discredit all nutrition by a reference to its degenerate forms. Sometimes both kinds of ecstasy, the healthy and the psychopathic, are seen in the same person. Thus, in the cases of St. Catherine of Genoa and St. Catherine of Siena, it would seem that as their health became feebler and the nervous instability always found in persons of genius increased, their ecstasies became more frequent. But these were not healthy ecstasies, such as those which they experienced in the earlier stages of their careers, and which brought with them an access of vitality. They were the results of increasing weakness of body, not of the overpowering strength of the spirit. And there is evidence that Catherine of Genoa, that acute self-critic, was conscious of this. Those who attended on her did not know how to distinguish one state from the other, and hence on coming to she would sometimes say, "Why did you let me remain in this quietude from which I have almost died?" Her earlier ecstasies, on the contrary, had in a high degree the positive character of exaltation and life enhancement consequent upon extreme concentration on the absolute, as well as the merely negative character of annihilation of the surface consciousness. She came from them with renewed health and strength, as from a resting in heavenly places and a feeding on heavenly food, and side by side with this ecstatic life fulfilled the innumerable duties of her active vocation as hospital matron and spiritual mother of a large group of disciples. Many times, says her legend, she would hide herself in some secret place and there stay, and being sought she was found upon the ground, her face hidden in her hands, altogether beyond herself, in such a state of joy as is beyond thought or speech. And being called, yea, even in a loud voice, she heard not, and at other times she would go up and down, as if beyond herself, drawn by the impulse of love, she did this. And certain other times she remained for the space of 6 hours as if dead, but hearing herself called, suddenly she got up, and answering she would at once go about all that needed to be done, even the humblest things. And in thus leaving the all, she went without any grief, because she fled all selfhood, la proprietà, as if it were the devil. And when she came forth from her hiding place, her face was rosy as it might be a cherub's, and it seemed as if she might have said, "Who shall separate me from the love of God?" Very often, says St. Teresa, describing the results of such rapturous communion with pure love as that from which St. Catherine came joyous and rosy-faced, he who was before sickly and full of pain comes forth healthy and even with new strength, for it is something great that is given to the soul in rapture. B. Psychologically considered, all ecstasy is a form, the most perfect form, of the state which is technically called complete monoideism. that withdrawal of consciousness from circumference to centre, that deliberate attention to one thing, which we discussed in recollection, is here pushed, voluntarily or involuntarily, to its logical conclusion. It is 1. Always paid for by psychophysical disturbances. 2. Rewarded in healthy cases by an enormous lucidity, a supreme intuition in regard to the one thing on which the self's interest has been set. Such ecstasy, then, is an exalted form of contemplation, and might be expected in appropriate subjects to develop naturally from that state. A simple difference of degree, says Maury, separates ecstasy from the action of forcibly fixing an idea in the mind. Contemplation implies exercise of will, and the power of interrupting the extreme tension of the mind. In ecstasy, which is contemplation carried to its highest pitch, the will, although in the strictest sense able to provoke the state, is nevertheless unable to suspend it. In complete monoideism, then, the attention to one thing, and the inattention to all else, is so entire that the subject is entranced. Consciousness has been withdrawn from those centres which receive and respond to the messages of the external world. He neither sees, feels, nor hears. The ego dormio et cor meum vigilat of the contemplative ceases to be a metaphor and becomes a realistic description. It must be remembered that the whole trend of mystical education has been toward the production of this fixity of attention. Recollection and quiet led up to it. Contemplation cannot take place without it. All the mystics assure us that a unification of consciousness, in which all outward things are forgot, is the necessary prelude of union with the divine. For consciousness of the many and consciousness of the one are mutually exclusive states. Ecstasy for the psychologist is such a unification in its extreme form. The absorption of the self in the one idea, the one desire, is so profound, and in the case of the great mystics, so impassioned, that everything else is blotted out. The tide of life is withdrawn, not only from those higher centres which are the seats of perception and of thought, but also from those lower centres which govern the physical life. The whole vitality of the subject is so concentrated on the transcendental world, or in a morbid ecstatic, on the idea which dominates his mind, that body and brain alike are depleted of their energy in the interests of this supreme act. Since mystics have, as a rule, the extreme susceptibility to suggestions and impressions which is characteristic of artistic and creative types, it is not surprising that their ecstasies are often evoked, abruptly, by the exhibition of, or concentration upon, some loved and special symbol of the divine. Such symbols form the rallying points about which are gathered a whole group of ideas and intuitions. Their presence, sometimes the sudden thought of them, will be enough, in psychological language, to provoke a discharge of energy along some particular path. That is to say, to stir to life all those ideas and intuitions which belong to the self's consciousness of the Absolute, to concentrate vitality on them, and introduce the self into that world of perception of which they are, as it were, the material keys. Hence the profound significance of symbols for some mystics, their paradoxical clinging to outward forms, whilst declaring that the spiritual and intangible alone is real. For the Christian mystics, the sacraments and mysteries of faith have always provided such a point d'appui, and these often play a large part in the production of their ecstasies. For St. Catherine of Siena, and also very often for her namesake of Genoa, the reception of Holy Communion was the prelude to ecstasy. Julian of Norwich and St. Francis of Assisi became entranced whilst gazing on the crucifix. We are told of Denis the Carthusian that towards the end of his life, hearing the Veni Creator, or certain verses of the Psalms, he was at once wrapped in God and lifted up from the earth. Of St. Catherine of Siena, her biographer says that she used to communicate with such fervour that immediately afterwards she would pass into the state of ecstasy, in which for hours she would be totally unconscious. On one occasion, finding her in this condition, they, the Dominican friars, forcibly threw her out of the church at midday, and left her in the heat of the sun, watched over by some of her companions till she came to her senses. Another, catching sight of her in the church when she was in ecstasy, came down and pricked her in many places with a needle. Catherine was not aroused in the least from her trance, but afterwards, when she came back to her senses, she felt the pain in her body and perceived that she had thus been wounded. It is interesting to compare with this objective description the subjective account of ecstatic union which St. Catherine gives in her Divine Dialogue. Here, the deeper self of the mystic is giving in a dramatic form its own account of its inward experiences. Hence we see the inward side of that outward state of entrancement, which was all that onlookers were able to perceive. As usual in the dialogue, the intuitive perceptions of the deeper self are attributed by St. Catherine to the divine voice speaking in her soul. Oftentimes, through the perfect union which the soul has made with me, she is raised from the earth almost as if the heavy body became light. But this does not mean that the heaviness of the body is taken away, but that the union of the soul with me is more perfect than the union of the body with the soul. Wherefore the strength of the spirit, united with me, raises the weight of the body from the earth, leaving it as if immovable, and all pulled to pieces in the affection of the soul. Thou rememberest to have heard it said of some creatures, that were it not for my goodness, in seeking strength for them, they would not be able to live. And I would tell thee that, in the fact that the souls of some do not leave their bodies, is to be seen a greater miracle than in the fact that some have arisen from the dead. So great is the union which they have with me. I, therefore, sometimes for a space withdraw from the union, making the soul return to the vessel of her body, from which she was separated by the affection of love. From the body she did not depart, because that cannot be except in death. The bodily powers alone departed, becoming united to me through affection of love. The memory is full of nothing but me. The intellect, elevated, gazes upon the object of my truth. The affection, which follows the intellect, loves and becomes united with that which the intellect sees. These powers being united and gathered together and immersed and inflamed in me, the body loses its feeling, so that the seeing eye sees not, and the hearing ear hears not, and the tongue does not speak, except as the abundance of the heart will sometimes permit it, for the alleviation of the heart, and the praise and glory of my name. The hand does not touch, and the feet walk not, because the members are bound with the sentiment of love. A healthy ecstasy so deep as this seems to be the exclusive prerogative of the mystics, perhaps because so great a passion, so profound a concentration, can be produced by nothing smaller than their flaming love of God. But as the technique of contemplation is employed more or less consciously by all types of creative genius, by inventors and philosophers, by poets, prophets, and musicians, by all the followers of the Triple Star, no less than by the mystic saints, so too this apotheosis of contemplation, the ecstatic state, sometimes appears in a less violent form, acting healthily and normally in artistic and creative personalities at a complete stage of development. It may accompany the prophetic intuitions of the seer, the lucidity of the great metaphysician, the artist's supreme perception of beauty or truth. As the saint is caught up to God, so these are caught up to their vision, their partial apprehensions of the absolute life. Those joyous, expansive, outgoing sensations, characteristic of the ecstatic consciousness, are theirs also. Their greatest creations are translations to us, not of something they have thought, but of something they have known, in a moment of ecstatic union with the great life of the all. We begin then to think that the pure monoideism which the psychologist identifies with ecstasy, though doubtless a part, is far from being the whole content of this state. True, the ecstatic is absorbed in his one idea, his one love. He is in it and with it. It fills his universe. But this unified state of consciousness does not merely pour upon something already possessed. When it only does this, it is diseased. Its true business is pure perception. It is outgoing, expansive. Its goal is something beyond itself. The rearrangement of the psychic self which occurs in ecstasy is not merely concerned with the normal elements of consciousness. It is rather a temporary unification of consciousness round that centre of transcendental perception which mystics call the apex or the spark of the soul. Those deeper layers of personality which normal life keeps below the threshold are active in it, and these are fused with the surface personality by the governing passion, the transcendent love which lies at the basis of all sane ecstatic states. The result is not merely a mind concentrated on one idea, nor a heart fixed on one desire, nor even a mind and a heart united in the interests of a beloved thought, but a whole being welded into one, all its faculties, neglecting their normal universe, grouped about a new centre, serving a new life, and piercing, like a single flame, the barriers of the sensual world. Ecstasy is the psychophysical state which may accompany this brief synthetic act. C. Therefore, whilst on its physical side ecstasy is an entrancement, on its mental side a complete unification of consciousness, on its mystical side it is an exalted act of perception. It represents the greatest possible extension of the spiritual consciousness in the direction of pure being. The blind intent stretching here receives its reward in a profound experience of eternal life. In this experience, the departmental activities of thought and feeling, the consciousness of I-hood, of space and time, all that belongs to the world of becoming and our own place therein, are suspended. The vitality which we are accustomed to split amongst these various things is gathered up to form a state of pure apprehension, a vivid intuition of, or, if you like, conjunction with, the transcendent. For the time of his ecstasy, the mystic is, for all practical purposes, as truly living in the supersensual world as the normal human animal is living in the sensual world. He is experiencing the highest and most joyous of those temporary and unstable states, those passive unions, in which his consciousness escapes from the limitations of the senses, rises to freedom, and is united for an instant with the great life of the all. Ecstasy, then, from the contemplative's point of view, is the development and completion of the horizon of union, and he is not always at pains to distinguish the two degrees, a fact which adds greatly to the difficulties of students. In both states, though he may, for want of better language, describe his experience in terms of sight, the transcendent is perceived by contact, not by vision. As, enfolded in darkness with one whom we love, we obtain a knowledge far more complete than that conferred by the sharpest sight, the most perfect mental analysis. In ecstasy, the apprehension is perhaps more definitely beatific than in the horizon of union. Such memory of his feeling state as the ecstatic brings back with him is more often concerned with an exultant certainty, a conviction that he has known for once the reality which hath no image, and solved the paradox of life, than with meek self-loss in that cloud of unknowing, where the contemplative in union is content to meet his beloved. The true note of ecstasy, however, its only valid distinction from infused contemplation, lies in entrancement, in being ravished out of fleshly feeling, as St. Paul caught up to the third heaven, not in the lifting of mind unto God. This, of course, is an outward distinction only, and a rough one at that, since entrancement has many degrees, but it will be found the only practical basis of classification. Probably none but those who have experienced these states know the actual difference between them. Even St. Teresa's psychological insight fails her here, and she is obliged to fall back on the difference between voluntary and involuntary absorption in the divine, a difference not in spiritual values, but merely in the psychophysical constitution of those who have perceived these values. I wish I could explain with the help of God, she says, wherein union differs from rapture, or from transport, or from flight of the spirit, as they call it, or from trance, which are all one. I mean that all these are only different names for that one and the same thing, which is also called ecstasy. It is more excellent than union, the fruits of it are much greater, and its other operations more manifold, for union is uniform in the beginning, the middle, and the end, and is so also interiorly. But as raptures have ends of a much higher kind, they produce effects both within and without, i.e., both physical and psychical. A rapture is absolutely irresistible, whilst union, inasmuch as we are then on our own ground, may be hindered, though that resistance be painful and violent. End of first half of Part 2, Chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Joy Chan. Mysticism, A Study in Nature and Development of Spiritual Consciousness by Evelyn Underhill. Second half of Part 2, Chapter 8. From the point of view of mystical psychology, our interest in ecstasy will centre in 2 points. 1. What has the mystic to tell us of the object of his ecstatic perception? 2. What is the nature of the peculiar consciousness which he enjoys in his trance? That is to say, what news does he bring us as to the being of God and the powers of man? It may be said generally that on both these points he bears out, amplifies, and expresses under formulae of greater splendour, with an accent of greater conviction, the general testimony of the contemplatives. In fact, we must never forget that an ecstatic is really nothing else than a contemplative of a special kind, with a special psychophysical make-up. Moreover, we have seen that it is not always easy to determine the exact point at which entrancement takes place, and deep contemplation assumes the ecstatic form. The classification, like all classifications of mental states, is an arbitrary one, whilst the extreme cases present no difficulty. There are others less complete, which form a graduated series between the deeps of the quiet and the heights of rapture. We shall never know, for instance, whether the ecstasies of Plotinus and of Pascal involved true bodily entrancement, or only a deep absorption of the unitive kind. So too the language of many Christian mystics when speaking of their raptures is so vague and metaphorical that it leaves us in great doubts as to whether they mean by rapture the abrupt suspension of normal consciousness, or merely a sudden and agreeable elevation of soul. Ravishing, says Rolle, as it is showed, in 2 ways is to be understood. One manner, forsooth, in which a man is ravished out of fleshly feeling, so that for the time of his ravishing, plainly he feels naught in flesh, nor what is done of his flesh, and yet he is not dead, but quick, for yet the soul to the body gives life. And on this manner saints sometime are ravished, to their profit and other men's learning, as Paul ravished to the 3rd heaven. And on this manner sinners also in vision sometime are ravished, that they may see joys of saints and pains of damned for their correction. And many other as we read of. Another manner of ravishing there is, that is lifting of mind into God by contemplation. And this manner of ravishing is in all that are perfect lovers of God, and in none of them but that love God. And as well this is called a ravishing as the other, for with a violence it is done, and as it were against nature. It is, however, very confusing to the anxious inquirer when, as too often, lifting of mind by contemplation is as well called a ravishing as the other, and ecstasy is used as a synonym for gladness of heart. Here, so far as is possible, these words will be confined to their strict meaning, and not applied generally to the description of all the outgoing and expansive states of the transcendental consciousness. What does the mystic claim that he attains in this abnormal condition, this irresistible trance? The price that he pays is heavy, involving much psychophysical wear and tear. He declares that his rapture or ecstasy includes a moment, often a very short and always an indescribable moment, in which he enjoys a supreme knowledge of, or participation in, divine reality. He tells us under various metaphors that he then attains pure being, his source, his origin, his beloved, is engulfed in the very thing for which he longs, which is God. O wonder of wonders, cries Eckhart, when I think of the union the soul has with God. He makes the enraptured soul to flee out of herself, for she is no more satisfied with anything that can be named. The spring of divine love flows out of the soul and draws her out of herself into the unnamed being, into her first source, which is God alone. This momentary attainment of the source, the origin, is the theme of all descriptions of mystic ecstasy. In Ruhlmann Merswin's Book of the Nine Rocks, that brief and overwhelming rapture is the end of the pilgrim's long trials and ascents. The vision of the infinite lasted only for a moment. When he came to himself, he felt inundated with life and joy. He asked, "Where have I been?" And he was answered, "In the upper school of the Holy Spirit." There you were surrounded by the dazzling pages of the Book of Divine Wisdom. Your soul plunged therein with delight, and the Divine Master of the school has filled her with an exuberant love by which even your physical nature has been transfigured. Another friend of God, Alina von Kreselsheim, who was of so abnormal a psychic constitution that her absorption in the divine love caused her to remain dumb for 7 years, was touched by the hand of God at the end of that period, and fell into a 5 days' ecstasy, in which pure truth was revealed to her, and she was lifted up to an immediate experience of the Absolute. There she saw the interior of the Father's heart, and was bound with chains of love, enveloped in light, and filled with peace and joy. In this transcendent act of union, the mystic sometimes says that he is conscious of nothing. But it is clear that this expression is figurative, for otherwise he would not have known that there had been an act of union. Were his individuality abolished, it could not have been aware of its attainment of God. What he appears to mean is that consciousness so changes its form as to be no longer recognizable or describable in human speech. In the paradoxical language of Richard of St. Victor, in a wondrous fashion, remembering we do not remember, seeing we do not see, understanding we not understand, penetrating we do not penetrate. In this indescribable but most actual state, the whole self, exalted and at white heat, is unified and poured out in one vivid act of impassioned perception, which leaves no room for reflection or self-observation. That aloof somewhat in us, which watches all our actions, splits our consciousness, has been submerged. The mystic is attending exclusively to eternity, not to his own perception of eternity, that he can only consider when the ecstasy itself is at an end. All things I then forgot, my cheek on him who for my coming came. All ceased, and I was not, leaving my cares and shame among the lilies, and forgetting them. This is that perfect unity of consciousness, that utter concentration on an experience of love which excludes all conceptual and analytic acts. Hence, when the mystic says that his faculties were suspended, that he knew all and knew naught, he really means that he was so concentrated on the Absolute that he ceased to consider his separate existence, so merged in it that he could not perceive it as an object of thought, as the bird cannot see the air which supports it, nor the fish the ocean in which it swims. He really knows all, but thinks naught, perceives all, but conceives naught. The ecstatic consciousness is not self-conscious. It is intuitive, not discursive. Under the sway of a great passion, possessed by a great idea, it has become a single state of enormous intensity. In this state it transcends our ordinary processes of knowledge and plunges deep into the heart of reality. A fusion which is the anticipation of the unitive life takes place, and the ecstatic returns from this brief foretaste of freedom, saying, "I know, as having known, the meaning of existence." The same centre of the universe, at once the wonder and the assurance of the soul. This utter transformation of the soul in God, says St. Teresa, describing the same experience in the official language of theology, continues only for an instant. Yet while it continues, no faculty of the soul is aware of it, or knows what is passing there. Nor can it be understood while we are living on the earth. At least God will not have us understand it, because we must be incapable of understanding it. I know is by experience. The utterances of those who know by experience are here of more worth than all the statements of psychology, which are concerned of necessity with the outward signs of this inward and spiritual grace. To these we must go if we would obtain some hint of that which ecstasy may mean to the ecstatic. When the soul, forgetting itself, dwells in that radiant darkness, says Suso, it loses all its faculties and all its qualities, as St. Bernard has said, and this more or less completely, according to whether the soul, whether in the body or out of the body, is more or less united to God. This forgetfulness of self is, in a measure, a transformation in God, who then becomes, in a certain manner, all things for the soul, as Scripture saith. In this rapture the soul disappears, but not yet entirely. It acquires, it is true, certain qualities of divinity, but does not naturally become divine. To speak in the common language, the soul is wrapped by the divine power of resplendent being, above its natural faculties, into the nakedness of the nothing. Here Suso is trying to describe his rapturous attainment of God in the negative terms of Dionysian theology. It is probable that much of the language of that theology originated not in the abstract philosophizings, but in the actual ecstatic experience of the Neoplatonists, who, Christian and pagan alike, believed in and sometimes deliberately induced this condition as the supreme method of attaining the One. The whole Christian doctrine of ecstasy, on its metaphysical side, really descends from that great practical transcendentalist Plotinus, who is known to have been an ecstatic, and has left in his sixth Aeneid a description of the mystical trance obviously based upon his own experiences. Then, he says, the soul neither sees nor distinguishes by seeing, nor imagines that there are two things, but becomes, as it were, another thing, ceases to be itself and belong to itself. It belongs to God and is one with him, like two concentric circles. Concurring they are one, but when they separate, they are two. Since in this conjunction with deity they were not two things, but the perceiver was one with the thing perceived, if a man can preserve the memory of what he was when he mingled with the divine, he would have within himself an image of God. For there nothing stirred within him, neither anger nor desire, nor even reason, nor a certain intellectual perception, nor, in short, was he himself moved, if we may assert this. But being in an ecstasy, tranquil and alone with God, he enjoyed an unbreakable calm. Ecstasy, says Plotinus in another part of the same treatise, is another mode of seeing, a simplification and abandonment of oneself, a desire of contact, rest, and a striving after union. All the phases of the contemplative experience seem to be summed up in this phrase. It has been said by some critics that the ecstasy of Plotinus was different in kind from the ecstasy of the Christian saints, that it was a philosophic rhapsody, something like Plato's saving madness, which is also regarded on somewhat insufficient evidence as being an affair of the head and entirely unconnected with the heart. At first sight, the arid metaphysical language in which Plotinus tries to tell his love offers some ground for this view. Nevertheless, the ecstasy itself is a practical manner, and has its root, not in reason, but in a deep-seated passion for the absolute, which is far nearer to the mystic's love of God than to any intellectual curiosity, however sublime. The few passages in which it is mentioned tell us what his mystical genius drove him to do, and not what his philosophical mind encouraged him to think or say. At once, when we come to these passages, we notice a rise of temperature, an alteration of values. Plotinus the ecstatic is sure, whatever Plotinus the metaphysician may think, that the union with God is a union of hearts, that by love he may be gotten and holden, but by thought never. He, no less than the medieval contemplatives, is convinced, to quote his own words, that the vision is only for the desirous, for him who has that loving passion which causes the lover to rest in the object of his love. The simile of marriage, of conjunction as the soul's highest bliss, which we are sometimes told that we owe in part to the unfortunate popularity of the Song of Songs, in part to the sexual aberrations of celibate saints, is found in the work of this hard-headed pagan philosopher, who was as celebrated for his practical kindness and robust common sense as for his transcendent intuitions of the one. The greatest of the pagan ecstatics, then, when speaking from experience, anticipates the Christian contemplatives. His words, too, when compared with theirs, show how delicate are the shades which distinguish ecstasy such as this from the highest forms of orison. Tranquil and alone with God, mingled for an instant of time like two concentric circles with the divine life, perceiver and perceived made one. This is as near as the subtle intellect of Alexandria can come to the reality of that experience in which the impassioned monoideism of great spiritual genius conquers the rebellious senses, and becomes, if only for a moment, operative on the highest levels accessible to the human soul. Self-mergence, then, that state of transcendence in which, the barriers of selfhood abolished, we receive the communication of life and of beatitude, in which all things are consummated and all things are renewed, is the secret of ecstasy, as it was the secret of contemplation. On their spiritual side, the two states cannot, save for convenience of description, be divided. Where contemplation becomes expansive, outgoing, self-giving, and receives a definite fruition of the absolute in return, its content is already ecstatic. Whether its outward form shall be so depends on the body of the mystic, not on his soul. Se lato della mente è tutto consupito, en Dio stando rapito, che se non se ritrova, in mezzo de sto mare, essendosi abissato, Dio non ci trova lato, onde ne possa uscire, de se non può pensare, ne dir come è formato, però che, trasformato, altro sia vestire. Tutto lo suo sentire e ben sa va notando, bellezza contemplando, la qual non ha colore. The activity of the mind is lulled to rest. Wrapped in God, it can no longer find itself. Being so deeply engulfed in that ocean, now it can find no place to issue therefrom. Of itself it cannot think, nor can it say what it is like, because transformed it hath another vesture. All its perceptions have gone forth to gaze upon the good, and contemplate that beauty which has no likeness. Thus sang Jacopone de Todi of the ecstatic soul, and here the descriptive powers of one who was both a poet and a mystic bring life and light to the dry theories of psychology. He continues, and here, in perhaps the finest of all poetic descriptions of ecstasy, he seems to echo at one point Plotinus, at another Richard of St. Victor, at once to veil and reveal the utmost secrets of the mystic life. Aperte son la porte facta a congiunzione, et è in possessione de tutte quel de Dio. Sente que non sentio, que non connove vede, possede que non crede, gusta senza sapere. Però casse perduto, tutto senza misura, possede quell'utura de summa smissuranza. Perché non ottenuto sen altra mistura, quel ben senza figura, ricera e abbondanza. The doors are flung wide. Conjoined to God, it possesses all that is in him. It feels that which it felt not, sees that which it knew not, possesses that which it believed not, tastes though it savours not. Because it is wholly lost to itself, it possesses that height of unmeasured perfection. Because it has not retained in itself the mixture of any other thing, it has received in abundance that imageless good. This ineffable awareness, in Dio stando rapito, this union with the imageless good, is not the only, though it is the purest, form taken by ecstatic apprehension. Many of the visions and voices described in a previous chapter were experienced in the entranced or ecstatic state, generally when the first violence of the rapture was past. St. Francis and St. Catherine of Siena both received the stigmata in ecstasy. Almost all the entrancements of Suso, and many of those of St. Teresa and Angelo Foligno, entailed symbolic vision rather than pure perception of the absolute. More and more, then, we are forced to the opinion that ecstasy, in so far as it is not a synonym for joyous and expansive contemplation, is really the name of the outward condition rather than of any one kind of inward experience. Rapture. In all the cases which we have been considering, and they are characteristic of a large group, the onset of ecstasy has been seen as a gradual, though always involuntary process. Generally, it has been the culminating point of a period of contemplation. The self, absorbed in the horizon of quiet or of union, or some analogous concentration on its transcendental interests, has passed over the limit of these states and slid into a still ecstatic trance, with its outward characteristics of rigid limbs, cold and depressed respiration. The ecstasy, however, instead of developing naturally from a state of intense absorption in the divine vision, may seize the subject abruptly and irresistibly when in his normal state of consciousness. This is strictly what ascetic writers mean by rapture. We have seen that the essence of the mystic life consists in the remaking of personality, its entrance into a conscious relation with the Absolute. This process is accompanied in the mystic by the development of an art expressive of his peculiar genius, the art of contemplation. His practice of this art, like the practice of poetry, music, or any other form of creation, may follow normal lines, at first amenable to the control of his will, and always dependent on his own deliberate attention to the supreme object of his quest, that is to say, on his horizon. His mystic states, however they may end, will owe their beginning to some voluntary act upon his part, a deliberate response to the invitation of God, a turning from the visible to the invisible world. Sometimes, however, his genius for the transcendent becomes too strong for the other elements of character, and manifests itself in psychic disturbances, abrupt and ungovernable invasions from the subliminal region, which make its exercise parallel to the fine frenzy of the prophet, the composer, or the poet. Such is rapture, a violent and uncontrollable expression of genius for the absolute, which temporarily disorganizes and may permanently injure the nervous system of the self. Often, but not necessarily, rapture, like its poetic equivalent, yields results of great splendor and value for life. But it is an accident, not an implicit of mystical experience, an indication of disharmony between the subject's psychophysical makeup and his transcendental powers. Rapture, then, may accompany the whole development of selves of an appropriate type. We have seen that it is a common incident in mystical conversion. The violent uprush of subliminal intuitions by which such conversion is marked disorganizes the normal consciousness, overpowers the will and the senses, and entails a more or less complete entrancement. This was certainly the case with Suso and Wilman Mersman, and perhaps with Pascal, whose certitude, peace, joy, sums up the exalted intuition of perfection and reality, the conviction of a final and unforgettable knowledge, which is characteristic of all ecstatic perception. In her Spiritual Relations, St. Teresa speaks in some detail of the different phases or forms of expression of these violent ecstatic states. Trance, which in her system means that which we have called ecstasy, and transport, or flight of the spirit, which is the equivalent of rapture. The difference between trance and transport, she says, is this. In a trance, the soul gradually dies to outward things, losing the senses and living unto God. But a transport comes on by one sole act of His Majesty, wrought in the innermost part of the soul, with such swiftness that it is as if the higher part thereof were carried away, and the soul were leaving the body. Rapture, says St. Teresa in another place, comes in general as a shock, quick and sharp, before you can collect your thoughts or help yourself in any way. And you see and feel it as a cloud, or a strong eagle rising upwards and carrying you away on its wings. I repeat it, you feel and see yourself carried away, you know not whither. This carrying away sensation may even assume the concrete form which is known as levitation, when the upward and outward sensations so dominate the conscious field that the subject is convinced that she is raised bodily from the ground. It seemed to me, when I tried to make some resistance, as if a great force beneath my feet lifted me up. I know of nothing with which to compare it, but it was much more violent than the other spiritual visitations, and I was therefore as one ground to pieces. And further, I confess that it threw me into a great fear, very great indeed at first, for when I saw my body thus lifted up from the earth, how could I help it? Though the spirit draws it upwards after itself, and that with great sweetness if unresisted, the senses are not lost. At least I was so much myself as to be able to see that I was being lifted up. So Woolman Merswan said that in the rapture which accompanied his conversion, he was carried round the garden with his feet off the ground. And St. Catherine of Siena, in a passage which I have already quoted, speaks of the strength of the spirit which raises the body from the earth. The subjective nature of this feeling of levitation is practically acknowledged by St. Teresa when she says, "When the rapture was over, my body seemed frequently to be buoyant, as if all weight had departed from it. So much so that now and then I scarcely knew that my feet touched the ground. But during the rapture, the body is very often, as it were, dead, perfectly powerless. It continues in the position it was in when the rapture came upon it, if sitting, sitting." Obviously here the outward conditions of physical immobility coexisted with the subjective sensation of being lifted up. The self's consciousness when in the condition of rapture may vary from the complete possession of her faculties claimed by St. Teresa to a complete entrancement. However abrupt the oncoming of the transport, it does not follow that the mystic instantly loses his surface consciousness. There remains the power of seeing and hearing, but it is as if the things heard and seen were at a great distance far away. They have retreated, that is to say, to the fringe of the conscious field, but may still remain just within it. Though the senses may not be entirely entranced, however, it seems that the power of movement is always lost. As in ecstasy, breathing and circulation are much diminished. By the command of the bridegroom, when he intends ravishing the soul, says St. Teresa, the doors of the mansions, and even those of the keep and of the whole castle, are closed, for he takes away the power of speech, and although occasionally the other faculties are retained rather longer, no word can be uttered. Sometimes the person is at once deprived of all the senses, the hands and body becoming as cold as if the soul had fled. Occasionally no breathing can be detected. This condition lasts but a short while. I mean in the same degree, for when this profound suspension diminishes, the body seems to come to itself, and gain strength to return again to this death which gives more vigorous life to the soul. This spiritual storm, then, in St. Teresa's opinion, enhances the vitality of those who experience it, makes them more living than before. It initiates them into heavenly secrets, and if it does not do this, it is no true rapture, but a physical weakness, such as women are prone to owing to their delicacy of constitution. Its sharpness and violence, however, leave considerable mental disorder behind. This supreme state of ecstasy never lasts long, but although it ceases, it leaves the will so inebriated and the mind so transported out of itself that for a day, or sometimes for several days, such a person is incapable of attending to anything but what excites the will to the love of God. Although wide awake enough to this, she seems asleep as regards all earthly matters. But when equilibrium is re-established, the true effects of this violent and beatific intuition of the Absolute begin to invade the normal life. The self which has thus been caught up to awareness of new levels of reality is stimulated to fresh activity by the strength of its impressions. It now desires an eternal union with that which it has known, with which for a brief moment it seemed to be merged. The peculiar talent of the mystic, power of apprehending reality which his contemplations have ordered and developed and his ecstasies express. Here reacts upon his life process, his slow journey from the many to the one. His nostalgia has been increased by a glimpse of the homeland, his intuitive apprehension of the absolute, which assumes in ecstasy its most positive form, spurs him on towards that permanent union with the divine which is his goal. Such great graces, says St. Teresa, leave the soul avid of total possession of that divine bridegroom who has conferred them. Hence the ecstatic states do not merely lift the self to an abnormal degree of knowledge. They enrich her life, contribute to the remaking of her consciousness, develop and uphold the strong and stormy love which drives her home. They give her the clearest vision she can have of that transcendent standard to which she must conform, entail her sharpest consciousness of the inflow of that life on which her little striving life depends. Little wonder, then, that, though the violence of the onset may often try his body to the full, the mystic comes forth from a good ecstasy, as Pascal from the experience of the fire, humbled yet exultant, marvellously strengthened, and ready, not for any passive enjoyments, but rather for the struggles and hardships of the way, the deliberate pain and sacrifice of love. In the third degree of ardent love, says Richard of St. Victor, love paralyzes action. Union, copula, is the symbol of this state. Ecstasy is its expression. The desirous soul, he says finally, no longer thirsts for God, but into God. The pull of its desire draws it into the infinite sea. The mind is borne away into the abyss of divine life, and, wholly forgetful of exterior things, knows not even itself, but passes utterly into its God. In this state, all earthly desire is absorbed in the heavenly glory. Whilst the mind is separated from itself, and whilst it is borne away into the secret place of the divine mystery, and is surrounded on all sides by the fire of divine love, it is inwardly penetrated and inflamed by this fire, and utterly puts off itself, and puts on a divine love, and being conformed to that beauty which it has beheld, it passes utterly into that other glory. Thus does the state of ecstasy contribute to the business of deification, of the remaking of the soul's substance in conformity with the goodness, truth, and beauty which is God. Being conformed to that beauty which it has beheld, it passes utterly into that other glory, into the flaming heart of reality, the deep but dazzling darkness of its home. End of Part 2, Chapter 8.